The stagecoach came to a halt in the middle of Caldwell, Kansas, on a Tuesday in late April of 1878, and every soul on the main street stopped what they were doing to stare at the young woman who stepped down from it alone, one infant pressed against her chest, and another balanced on her hip, with nothing but a worn leather satchel, and the kind of quiet desperation in her eyes that made even hardened men look away out of shame. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and she was 24 years old, and she had traveled 300 miles from St. Louis with 2 babies and no plan and no husband and no family waiting anywhere in the territory, because the man who had promised her all 3 of those things had taken one look at the twins when they arrived 6 months ago and walked straight out the door of their rented room and never came back. She had waited 2 months for him, believing he would return, believing that a man who had sworn before a preacher to love her through sickness and health would not simply evaporate like morning frost. But he had, and the money had run out, and the landlady had been kind for exactly as long as her patience allowed, and so Clara had sold her mother's silver brooch, the last thing she owned of any value, and bought passage west on the stagecoach because she had heard that in Kansas a person could reinvent themselves, could find land and work and a future, and because west was the only direction that had not already broken her. Caldwell in 1878 was a cattle town in the truest sense of the word, sitting just above the Oklahoma border on the Kishom Trail, loud and dusty, and full of cowboys who had been on the trail for weeks and wanted whiskey and noise and something to bet on. The main street was a stretch of packed earth between 2 rows of wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon called the Prairie Rose, a livery stable, a small church, a hotel that charged $2 a night, a barber, and a narrow building with a hand-painted sign that read Holt's Boarding House, reasonable rates, respectable guests. Clara stood on the wooden sidewalk with the babies and looked at that sign for a long moment, counting in her mind the coins she had left, and then she walked toward it because she had nowhere else to go. The boarding house was run by a woman named Agnes Holt, who was 60 years old and shaped like a barrel and had a voice like a cattle bell, and she came out from behind her counter when Clara pushed open the door, and her eyes went from Clara to the babies to the satchel, and she did not say anything for a moment, just looked. Clara straightened her spine and said, "I am looking for a room. I have money. Not much, but I have it, and I am willing to work for whatever the difference is." Agnes looked at her for a long moment, then at the babies, who were both remarkably quiet for infants, which Agnes took as a good sign. "How old are they?" Agnes asked. 6 months, Clara said. "A boy and a girl. They are good babies. They do not cry more than is reasonable." Agnes made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Room at the end of the hall, $1 a week. You cook breakfast on Wednesdays and Fridays." Clara felt something loosen in her chest, some tightly knotted thing she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was there. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected it to be. "Thank me by keeping them quiet after 9, Agnes said, and went back behind her counter. The room was small and clean, with a window that looked out onto the alley behind the building, and a narrow bed, and a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a wooden crate that Clara immediately lined with a folded blanket to make a sleeping space for the twins. She laid them both in it, side by side, and they looked up at her with identical dark eyes that were their father's one contribution to their existence, and she said quietly, to them and perhaps to herself, "We are going to be all right. I have decided that we are, so we will be." The boy she had named James, after her own father who had died of fever when she was 12. The girl she had named Rose, for no particular reason except that she had been born first and come out looking somehow like a rose looked, soft and pink, and startlingly beautiful for something that had just endured such a difficult arrival into the world. That first night Clara sat by the window after the babies slept and listened to Caldwell settle into its evening noise, the distant piano from the Prairie Rose, the occasional shout, the sound of horses, and she wrote in the small journal she kept a single line, "We arrived. We are here. Now what?" She had no answer yet for the now what, but she was going to find one. The boarding house had 4 other guests that week. A traveling dry goods salesman named Perkins, who sneezed constantly and apologized for it. A widow woman named Mabel, who was visiting her son's grave and had nowhere particular to go afterward. A young man from Ohio who wanted to homestead and had not yet learned how much the land had to say about that. And a cowboy named Eli Harte, who had come into town at the end of a cattle drive from Texas and had been at Agnes Holt's for 3 days because he had twisted his ankle on the last day of the drive and could not yet ride. Clara met Eli Harte at breakfast the next morning. He was sitting at the long table in Agnes's kitchen when Clara came in carrying both babies, one in each arm, which required a kind of balanced acrobatics she had become expert at over 6 months. He was 30 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days, and he was drinking coffee and reading a week-old newspaper, and he looked up when she came in, and his eyes went immediately to the babies in the way that everyone's eyes went to the babies. That particular mixture of surprise and curiosity and something else, something softer, that Clara had learned to identify as the good kind of staring. He stood up from the table, which she had not expected, and she stopped in the doorway. "Morning," he said. "You need a hand." "I am managing," she said, which was true in that she had not yet dropped anyone. "I don't doubt it," he said, "but I've got 2 good hands and only 1 good ankle, so the hands are looking for something useful to do." Clara looked at him. He had an honest face, the kind where nothing was working too hard to present itself as something it was not, and his eyes were a pale gray-green that she noticed and then deliberately stopped noticing. "You can take James," she said, nodding toward the boy, who was beginning to express opinions about being carried in his left arm, which was the less comfortable arm. "He is going through a phase." Eli Harte crossed the kitchen with a slight limp and took the baby with the practiced ease of someone who had held infants before, which surprised her. He tucked James against his chest with one large hand supporting the baby's back and the other under his bottom, and James looked up at him with the deeply suspicious expression that was his signature look, studying this new face with grave seriousness. "He's got a lot of thoughts," Eli said. "He has opinions about everything," Clara said, settling into a chair with Rose, who was already much more amenable to the world than her brother and was currently trying to eat Clara's collar. Eli sat back down across from her and continued holding James with a natural ease that made Clara feel something she immediately categorized as gratitude, and nothing more complicated than that. Agnes set breakfast on the table, biscuits and salt pork and eggs and more coffee, and the other boarders drifted in, and the morning proceeded, and Eli Harte did not ask her a single personal question, which she noticed and appreciated more than she could have explained to anyone. He just talked about the weather and the state of the Kishom Trail, and whether the beef market was going to hold, and he included her in the conversation as though she were simply a person at the table, and not a woman alone with 2 babies and a history written all over her face. Over the next several days, a pattern established itself without anyone planning it. Eli was not going anywhere until his ankle healed, which Agnes predicted would take another week at least given how purple it had turned, and Clara was not going anywhere because she had arrived, and this was where she was going to build her now what. And so they were both simply there, in the boarding house, in the kitchen, on the narrow porch in the evenings when the April air was cool enough to make sitting outside pleasant. Clara learned that Eli Harte was originally from Tennessee, that he had come west at 17 after the war had taken his father and left his family's farm in ruins, that he had been cowboying for 13 years and had done it well enough to save up a portion of money, that he had recently put a down payment on a small ranch property about 6 miles outside of Caldwell, 80 acres of grass and creek and possibility, and that he had been planning to move onto it when he got back from the drive before his ankle made other plans. He learned from her exactly what she chose to tell him, which at first was not very much. She told him her name and that the babies were 6 months old and that she had come from St. Louis. He did not push for more, and she found that his not pushing made her want to tell him things she had not planned to say. On the third day she told him about her husband, or rather the man she had married who had become the man who had left, and she told it plainly, without self-pity, in the same tone she might use to describe the weather, because she had decided somewhere on that long stagecoach ride that she was not going to be a woman who spent her energy mourning a man who had not deserved her mourning. Eli listened without interrupting, which was another thing she noticed about him, his capacity to simply listen without filling the space with his own commentary. When she finished, he said, "That is a terrible thing he did." "Yes," she agreed. "You and those babies deserved better than that." "Yes," she agreed again. "We did, and we are going to have better than that, I have decided." He looked at her with something in his gray-green eyes that she could not quite name, something that sat somewhere between admiration and a feeling more complicated, and he said, "I believe you." The thing about Caldwell in the spring of 1878 was that it was not a forgiving place for a woman without a husband. Clara discovered this in layers, the way you discover that a river is deeper than it looks only after you have stepped into it. The women of the town's respectable class, the wives of the merchants and the banker and the church elder, were cordial but cool, the way polished steel is cordial, smooth and reflective, but giving nothing of warmth. They would nod at her on the street and ask after the babies in the way people ask after things they are curious about rather than things they care about, and their eyes would linger on her ringless finger, and she could see them doing the arithmetic of her situation and reaching conclusions that made their mouths go a little thin. She went to apply for work at the general store, and the owner, a man named Patterson who had a watch chain and an air of self-importance, listened to her explain that she had been a seamstress in St. Louis and was quick and reliable and honest. And then he said that he was sorry, but he did not think it would be appropriate to have a woman in her circumstances behind his counter. And she understood that circumstances meant unmarried and meant the twins and meant all of it. She went to the hotel and asked if they needed a laundress, and the manager looked at her and the babies and said the work was heavy and not suitable. She sat on a bench outside the general store and held the babies and felt the particular quiet fury of a woman who knows she is capable and is being told she is not, and she breathed through it the way she had breathed through labor, steadily and with intention. Agnes, when Clara came back to the boarding house and reported her mourning, made a sound of disgusted solidarity and said that she had work enough at the boarding house, and Clara could help with laundry and mending and meals for a reduction in her rent and a small wage on top. It was not enough to build a future on, but it was enough to stand on while she figured out how to build one, and Clara took it. She also, within that first week, began to understand that Caldwell was a place of rough edges and occasional real danger, but that it also contained genuine human warmth in places you would not necessarily expect to find it. The woman at the church, a reverend's wife named Hattie Mee Douglas, brought her a tin of cookies on her second day without explanation or condition, just knocked on the boarding house door and handed them over and said, "You look like someone who could use something sweet." The blacksmith across the street, an enormous man named Gus, watched her one morning through his open stable door as she walked past with the babies and called out that if she ever needed anything heavy moved or fixed she should ask, his tone gruff but his eyes kind. And there was Eli, who was simply there every morning at breakfast, every evening on the porch, easy and steady and unhurried in a way that felt, in the context of her life, like something miraculous. On the 5th day after her arrival, Eli's ankle was well enough to walk on without the limp being too pronounced, and he mentioned at breakfast that he was thinking of riding out to see his property, just a quick look, make sure everything was as he had left it when he had ridden by before the drive began. Clara looked up from feeding Rose and said, without planning to say it, "What is it like, the property?" Eli set down his coffee cup. "You want to see it?" She had not meant to invite herself, and she felt a flush of embarrassment. "I only meant you described it. I was picturing it." "Come see it," he said. "Agnes has a wagon. I'll ask her. The babies should see some open country. That is good for babies." Agnes did have a wagon, and she also had opinions about everything. And her opinion about Eli taking Clara and the babies to see the ranch property was expressed in a look she gave Clara that combined satisfaction and warning in equal measure. A look that said, "I see what is happening here, and you should see it too." And Clara received the look and then deliberately set it aside. The ride out to Eli's property took about 40 minutes in the wagon, along a track that ran between rolling grassland just beginning to go green with the spring. The sky enormous above them the way it only is in that part of Kansas, blue and wide and completely indifferent to human drama. And Clara held the babies on her lap and felt something she recognized as joy, or at least joy's close neighbor, the feeling of air and space, and the possibility of things being good. Eli's property was a piece of land that made your chest expand when you looked at it. A low house that needed work, walls solid but the porch sagging, a barn in better shape than the house, a creek running along the eastern edge lined with cottonwoods just coming into leaf, and 80 acres of grass going in every direction toward the horizon. Clara stood in the yard with the babies and looked at the house and the barn and the creek and the wide green land and felt something she had not expected to feel, which was that this place looked like exactly the right shape of a life. "It needs work," Eli said, standing beside her. He was looking at the porch with the critical eye of a man calculating labor. "The porch needs rebuilding. The kitchen inside needs a proper stove. The windows need new glass on the south side." "But the bones are good," Clara said, because she could see that they were. He looked at her. "Yes, the bones are good." They walked through the house, which smelled of dust and emptiness, and the particular cold of a place that has not had a fire in it for a while. And Clara carried Rose and Eli carried James, and they went from room to room, and Clara noticed things without meaning to. The way the morning light came through the east windows into what would be the kitchen, the way the main room was a good size, the way there were 2 rooms off the main room that could be bedrooms. On the drive back, she thought about the house more than she thought about Eli. Or rather, she thought about both of them at the same time, and was not yet willing to examine what that meant. 2 weeks into her time in Caldwell, on a warm evening in mid-May, Clara was sitting on the boarding house porch with the babies asleep inside, and a piece of mending in her lap, and Eli was sitting in the other chair with his coffee, and the conversation had gone quiet in the comfortable way that conversations do between people who have found each other easy, and then Eli said something that changed the shape of the evening. "I have been thinking," he said. "About what?" Clara said, not looking up from her mending. "About the ranch, about the work it needs, and about what it would take to make it into something real." He paused. "And about you." She looked up then. He met her eyes directly, the way she had learned he always did when he was saying something serious. "I know this is not the ordinary way of things. I know we have known each other 2 weeks, and I know you have had a hard time of it, and I know you are not looking for anyone to need. But I would like to say it plainly because I think you are the kind of woman who prefers plainness." "I am," she said. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you would allow it. Nothing rushed. Nothing that asks more of you than you are ready to give. But I would like to try, and I would like you to know that when I look at you and those babies, I do not see something complicated. I see something good that I would very much like to be part of if you will let me." Clara was quiet for a moment. The porch was still, and the evening was warm, and somewhere down the street, the Prairie Rose Saloon was playing its piano, and the stars were beginning to appear over the dark Kansas plain. "You understand," she said carefully, "that I come with a great deal of complexity. 2 babies who are not yours. A history that the town already knows and has already judged. A former husband who may or may not ever be found or divorced or dealt with legally. I am not a simple proposition, Eli." "No," he agreed, "you are not. Simple propositions are boring." I have been on cattle drives for 13 years and I have seen enough boring to last me. Something moved in her chest, something warm and cautious and real. All right, she said. Court me properly, but slowly. He nodded. Slowly, he agreed. He was exactly as good as his word. He was patient in a way that felt like a physical thing, like you could lean against it and trust it to hold. He did not push or press or ask for more than she was ready to give. He simply showed up, day after day, in the small practical ways that in the long view turned out to matter far more than gestures. He fixed the loose step on Agnes's front porch because he noticed it before Clara did, and did not want her to catch her heel on it carrying the babies. He found out that James had developed a fondness for being sung to, not particularly sweetly and not with any great skill, and so he took to singing low and slightly off-key while he held the baby in the evenings. Some old Tennessee song that Clara could not make out the words of, but that James appeared to find deeply satisfying. He took her to Sunday services at the small church, walking beside her through the curious eyes of the town, not flinching when the more rigid members of the congregation were less than warm, simply steady, simply there. He introduced her to the men he knew, other cattlemen and ranchers, with a matter-of-fact respect that made it clear he expected them to extend the same, and most of them did because Eli Harte had been on the trail long enough that his regard for someone was a kind of endorsement. Reverend Douglas and his wife Hattie Mee were particularly kind. They had them to supper twice and talked about the town and the land and the future, and Hattie Mee held Rose with the practiced ease of a woman who had raised several of her own. And the evening felt so much like the kind of life Clara had imagined once that she had to be careful not to hold it too tightly, because she had learned what happened to things you held too tightly. The question of her former husband was the stone in the road that had to be addressed eventually, and the addressing of it fell to a man named Silas Beaumont, who was Caldwell's closest approximation to a lawyer, and who had handled various legal matters for the surrounding territory. Clara went to see him in early June, leaving the babies with Agnes for the morning, and sat across from him in his small cluttered office, and explained her situation. Silas Beaumont was a thin man of about 50 with a neat beard and reading spectacles and the resigned air of someone who had heard every variety of human trouble and been surprised by none of it. He listened, made notes, and said that the situation, while not simple, was also not impossible. If her husband, whose name had been Walter Whitmore, had been absent for more than 1 year without contact or support, there were legal grounds in the territory for abandonment, and a petition for divorce could be filed through the district court. It would take time and some money, but it could be done. Clara set her jaw and said that she would find the money and he should begin the process. She told Eli about it that evening on the porch, expecting she did not know what, perhaps some tension about the complication of it, and instead he said, "I know a man in Wichita who can help move things along. I'll write to him." "You do not need to do that," she said. "I know I do not need to," he said. "I want to." She looked at him in the evening light, this large, quiet man who kept finding ways to be useful without making her feel that she owed him anything for it, and she felt something shift in herself, some final resistance beginning to soften. "Eli," she said. "Yes. Why are you doing all of this, honestly? Why?" He thought about it for a moment in the way he always thought about things, not quickly but thoroughly, taking the question seriously. "Because I spent 13 years on cattle drives," he said finally, "and before that in a war that took everything my family had, and in all of that time I was waiting for something that felt like a reason to stop moving. And you walked into Agnes's kitchen carrying 2 babies and with more determination in your face than I have seen in most men twice your size, and something in me said, there it is. There is the reason." He paused. "I know that sounds like too much." "It does not sound like too much," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "It sounds exactly right." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat that way in the warm Kansas evening, not talking, while the stars came out. The summer of 1878 in Caldwell was hot and occasionally wild in the ways that cattle towns in Kansas were wild. Drovers coming through with money in their pockets and a season of trail dust in their bones, looking to shake loose both. There were arguments in the prairie rows, and once a gunfight in the street that Clara heard from the boarding house and did not go to look at because she had 2 babies and no time for other people's drama. The town had a marshal named Heck Henderson, who was competent enough to keep things from going completely sideways, and life in its daily rhythms continued. Clara had, by June, established herself well enough that Patterson at the general store had reconsidered his position, helped along by the fact that 2 of the cattlemen's wives had specifically asked after her and her work, because her mending and sewing had become known as excellent. And Patterson's wife had come to her with a dress that needed alterations and been so pleased with the result that she had told her husband, with the particular emphasis of a wife who expects to be listened to, that he was being foolish, passing up reliable help on principle. So Clara began working 3 mornings a week at the general store, and Agnes watched the babies those mornings, and the extra money went into a small tin that she kept under the mattress. She was building something. She could feel it, brick by brick, day by day, the structure of an independent life taking shape under her hands. Eli, meanwhile, had begun working his ranch property on the days he was not in town, riding out in the morning and coming back in the evenings, and he had hired 2 men to help him rebuild the porch and repair the south windows and get the kitchen stove properly installed. And he had cattle, 12 head of shorthorn he had bought with part of his drive money, grazing his 80 acres. He talked about the ranch at supper with the careful enthusiasm of a man who loves something, and is slightly afraid to love it too loudly in case it hears him and runs. One morning in July, he came to the boarding house and asked Clara if she would come out to the ranch with him that afternoon, that he had something he wanted to show her. They drove out in the wagon, the babies in the back on a pile of folded blankets, the Kansas afternoon enormous and blue above them, and when they arrived at the property Clara saw immediately what had changed. The porch was rebuilt, solid and level, with new boards that were still pale with newness, and there were 2 chairs on it and a small table between the chairs, and sitting on the table was a jar of wildflowers, the kind that grew along the creek, yellow and purple and white. She stopped the wagon and looked at it. "The porch is done," Eli said, not quite managing to make his voice casual. "I can see that," Clara said. "I thought you might like to sit on it." She climbed down from the wagon and lifted Rose out of the back, and Eli lifted James, and they walked up onto the new porch and sat in the chairs, and the ranch spread out before them in the summer afternoon light, the grass golden at the edges where the sun had been working on it, the cottonwoods along the creek dark green and full, the cattle small in the far distance doing the slow, patient business of being cattle. "Eli," she said, "yes, this is a very good piece of land." "It is," he agreed. "It would be better with more on it. More cattle in time, maybe some horses, a proper kitchen garden, maybe chickens." "Chickens are good to have," she said. "Yes." He looked at her sideways. "It would also be better," he said very carefully, "if it were not something I was trying to build alone." The summer afternoon was very still. James had gone to sleep against Eli's shoulder in the boneless way that babies sleep, completely surrendered, and Rose was watching a butterfly with the focused intensity she brought to all new things. "Are you asking me something?" Clara said. "I am working up to it," he said. "I want to do it right." "Then do it," she said, and her voice was gentle and certain and a little nervous, which surprised her. He shifted James carefully to his left arm and turned in the chair to face her and said, "Clara Whitmore, I would like very much for you to marry me. Not because you need someone to take care of you, because you have made it perfectly clear you are fully capable of taking care of yourself and those babies, but because I believe we could build something here that would be worth building. And I believe that you and James and Rose are the 3 best reasons I have ever had to stop moving and stay somewhere. There is room for 3 more here," he said, gesturing at the ranch with a slight smile. "And I would very much like that room to be filled by you." Clara looked at him and at the ranch and at her sleeping son in his arms and at her daughter watching the butterfly, and she thought of the stagecoach and the 200 and some miles behind her, and the morning she had stood on the sidewalk in Caldwell with everything she owned in a worn leather satchel, and decided that she was going to be all right because she had decided to be. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Eli Harte." The smile that crossed his face was not the polished smile of a man performing happiness. It was the raw and slightly startled smile of a person who has just received something they were not entirely sure they would be allowed to have. And it was, she thought, one of the most genuinely beautiful things she had ever seen. He leaned across the space between the chairs and kissed her softly once, and she kissed him back. And James slept through the whole thing, and Rose continued to watch the butterfly. The process of getting married in Caldwell in 1878 had several complications, the primary one being that Clara was technically still married to Walter Whitmore, a fact that Silas Beaumont was working to legally resolve, and which meant that the wedding had to wait for the paperwork. Eli said this was fine and that they had plenty of time, and Clara said she was sorry, and he said that she had nothing to be sorry for and that he had waited 13 years already and he could wait a bit longer. The divorce petition moved through the district court over the summer, helped along by the letter Eli had written to his contact in Wichita. Walter Whitmore, it turned out, had not been difficult to locate because he had made no particular effort to hide himself, having apparently simply moved on to another life in St. Louis as though the first one had never happened. He did not contest the divorce. He did not respond at all to the legal notices, which Silas Beaumont said actually made things simpler, and by late August the district court judge had granted Clara the divorce on grounds of abandonment. She held the document and felt not triumph exactly and not grief either, but something in between, a closing, a door going shut on a room she had never wanted to be in. She showed it to Eli that evening. He looked at it and then looked at her and said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. And she was. She truly was. They were married on a Saturday in September of 1878 in Reverend Douglas's small white church, with Agnes Holt as witness on Clara's side and a fellow cattleman named Tom Ridley as witness on Eli's. Hattie Mee Douglas decorated the church with late-season sunflowers from her garden, great armfuls of them, and their yellow was bright against the whitewashed walls. Clara wore the best dress she had, a blue cotton that she had altered and pressed and added a small piece of lace at the collar, and she carried James on her hip because he was having a day of strong opinions about being put down, and Rose rode in Agnes's arms in the front pew and watched the proceedings with great seriousness. Eli stood at the front of the church in a clean shirt and his good boots and the jacket he had bought for the occasion, and when Clara came down the short aisle, he watched her with an expression that made several women in the small congregation reach for handkerchiefs, not because it was performed, but because it was not. They spoke their vows in steady voices, and Reverend Douglas, who was a practical man with a poet's heart, added his own observation before pronouncing them married, that what was being joined that day was not simply two people but two histories and two futures and three souls who had found each other by a combination of circumstance and courage, and that was as good a foundation as any church had ever been asked to bless. Agnes cried and claimed afterward that she had not. Tom Ridley shook Eli's hand so hard that Eli said afterward his fingers had gone numb. Hattie Mee held Rose up so the baby could see the kiss, which made the whole congregation laugh. They moved to the ranch the following week, the 6-mile wagon ride that had been practice runs suddenly the real thing, the boarding house behind them and the ranch ahead. And when Clara carried the babies through the door of the house that was now her house, she stopped in the kitchen and looked at the morning light coming through the east windows exactly as she had noticed it would, and felt the truth of the word home settle into her like something finding its rightful place after a long time lost. The first weeks on the ranch were a lesson in the particular exhaustion and satisfaction of building a life from the ground up. There was more work than two people with two babies could easily manage, but they were both people who had been working hard for years and had no particular fear of more of it. Clara organized the house with a thoroughness that impressed Eli, who had been living with the essentials of a cattle drive man's sensibility and had not given much thought to the domestic architecture of a home. She knew where the light fell and where the drafts came from and how to arrange things so that two babies could be safely in a space while work was being done. And within 2 weeks the house felt lived in and intentional in a way it had not before. Eli worked the cattle and the land with a steady industry, up before dawn and working until the light failed. And on the evenings when he was not too tired, he sat with Clara after the babies were down and talked about the ranch and about their days and about nothing important, just the talk of two people who have found each other's company the most comfortable place they know. She had not expected, after everything, to find marriage easy. Her first marriage had not been easy, had in fact been a series of small disappointments leading to the large one. But this was different in a way she was still learning to trust, the difference between something built on a true foundation and something built on wishful thinking. Eli was not a perfect man. He was stubborn about certain things, particularly about asking for help when he needed it, which was a quality she recognized as deeply Tennessean and not something that was going to change quickly. He had a temper that occasionally showed itself when things on the ranch went badly wrong, though it was the kind of temper that burned hot for a moment and then was gone, leaving him apologetic and somewhat sheepish. He was not always aware of how quiet he could go when he was working through something in his mind, and she had to learn that his silences were not directed at her, but were simply the way he thought. She, in turn, was more independent than was always convenient, which had been a survival mechanism for too long to simply set down. She occasionally made decisions about things without consulting him, not because she did not respect his opinion, but because she was still relearning the grammar of partnership. She was also, when she was tired, sharper than she meant to be, and she had to learn that he was not Walter Whitmore and that her sharp edges did not mean anything bad would happen. They were patient with each other's imperfections in the way that people are patient when they have chosen each other deliberately and know the value of what they have chosen. The twins grew. James developed a personality that was half stubborn determination and half absolute charm, a combination that was going to make him either a great success or a tremendous difficulty, and possibly both. He walked at 10 months with the unsteady enthusiasm of someone who has just discovered something wonderful and cannot believe it was there the whole time. Rose walked at 9 months, getting there first as she usually did, and then stood looking at her brother with an expression that contained what Clara chose to interpret as encouragement. They were both healthy and loud and full of the particular energy of children who are in the right place, and watching them in the ranch yard in the late afternoons of that first autumn, learning the grass and the dirt, and the sky the way children learn the things that will always be their first home, was one of the things that Clara returned to in her mind when she needed to know that the decision she had made on a stagecoach in April had been the right one. It had been the right one. She knew this more certainly with each passing week. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was hard in the way Kansas winters are hard, cold that had a bone-deep quality and snow that could cut off the ranch from the town for days at a time. They were prepared for it, having laid in supplies in the fall, but prepared and comfortable are different things, and there were stretches of days when the cold made everything harder and the work was twice as heavy. One particularly bad January storm, 2 days of snow and wind that kept them all inside, turned out to be one of the most quietly important stretches of their marriage. Confined together in the house with 2 toddlers and nowhere to go, they talked in the way that people only talk when there is nothing else to do and no escape from honesty. Eli told her things he had not told her before, about the war and what he had seen at 17, and how it had marked him, about his mother who had died the winter after the war ended from a grief that she did not have the resources to survive, about the long, empty years of the trail, and what it felt like to be a man without a place to belong. Clara told him about her own childhood, her father's death and her mother's long, difficult widowhood, about the loneliness of her first marriage even before Walter left, about the months after the babies came when she had been so afraid and so determined and so completely alone. They were sitting on either side of the fire with the babies asleep behind them in the bedroom, and the storm was loud outside, and the house was warm with the fire and their voices. And at some point in the middle of the night, they were not talking anymore but were simply close to each other in the firelight. And Clara thought that this was what she had been working toward without knowing it. This specific warmth, this particular sense of being known and held and not alone. Spring came again, as it does, making the ranch beautiful in the April way that first spring had made everything around Caldwell feel like possibility. And with the spring came the discovery that Clara was pregnant. She told Eli on a Tuesday morning in April, standing in the kitchen while he was drinking his coffee before going out to check on the cattle, and he set the coffee cup down and looked at her, and the expression on his face moved through surprise and then through something much deeper, something that looked like a man receiving a gift he had not known he wanted until it was in his hands. "A baby," he said. "Yes," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and put his arms around her carefully, which she found touching, as though she were suddenly made of something delicate, and she leaned into him and felt his heart beating fast under her cheek. "Are you happy?" she asked. "I am the happiest man in the Kansas Territory," he said, "possibly beyond the Kansas Territory." She laughed, which felt wonderful, the lightness of it. "James and Rose will have a brother or sister." "Yes," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "More room for," he said, echoing himself from that afternoon on the porch. "There always is," she said. The pregnancy was easier than the twins had been, which had been an ordeal in the way of all twin pregnancies, but particularly one managed largely alone. This time she had Eli, who was so conscientious about her health and comfort that she occasionally had to remind him that she was not in fact made of glass and could still carry things and ride short distances and do the 1,000 small tasks of a ranch wife. Hattie Mee Douglas became her closest friend during those months, coming out to the ranch twice a week, with the practical wisdom of a woman who had seen many pregnancies through in the territory, and bringing with her a warmth that Clara had learned by now to receive without deflection, because she had spent too many years deflecting kindness out of a sense that accepting it made her vulnerable, and she had decided that she was through with that particular habit. Agnes Holt came too, loud and efficient, and full of opinions about everything from the names they were considering to the state of the porch railing, which she felt needed attention. And her visits were a kind of tonic, bracing and honest, and accompanied by food, because Agnes believed that everything was better after eating. The baby was born in October of 1879, a boy, delivered by the town's doctor, a capable man named Dr. Emmett Crane, who had made the 6-mile ride in a cheerful spirit, and who pronounced the baby perfectly healthy and Clara remarkably composed for someone who had just done something so demanding. They named him William, for no particular famous reason, but because it was a solid, trustworthy name that had no unhappy associations, and seemed to suit the serious, quiet infant who regarded the world from the beginning with an expression of thoughtful assessment. Eli held William that first evening with the awe of a first-time father, which in every way that mattered he was, because James and Rose were as much his as any children could be, and he had never thought of it otherwise. But there was something particular about holding the baby who was new in every dimension, and Clara watched him from the bed and felt the full and completed feeling of a circle closing. James and Rose, now 18 months old and possessed of very decided personalities, were brought in to meet their new brother the next morning, and James regarded William with deep suspicion for approximately 2 minutes before losing interest in favor of a wooden horse Eli had carved for him. And Rose leaned in very carefully and touched William's hand with one finger, and then looked at Clara with an expression that seemed to say she approved, which seemed about right for Rose. The ranch grew. The second year brought more cattle, a small herd of horses that Eli had a particular feeling for and a talent with, and the kitchen garden that Clara had wanted, a proper one, fenced against rabbits, growing tomatoes and beans and squash, and the potatoes that were the backbone of every meal on the frontier. They hired a hand named Pete Grover, a quiet young man from Missouri who was efficient and honest and had no family in the territory, and who ate supper with them most evenings and became a kind of fixture on the ranch in the way that good hired hands do, part of the place without being part of the family exactly, but certainly not separate from it. The legal and social complications that Clara had worried about proved, over time, to be less consuming than she had feared. The town of Caldwell adjusted to the Hartes in the way that small towns eventually adjust to the facts of people's lives when those people are present and consistent, and not giving them cause for further gossip. There were those who remained chilly, and Clara learned to register their coolness with equanimity, because their opinion of her circumstances had no bearing on the actual quality of her life, and she had decided not to give them rent-free space in her mind. The women who had been warm from the beginning, Hattie Mee and Agnes and one or two others, became the social world she chose, which suited her. She was not a woman who needed a wide society. She was a woman who needed a small number of true things, and she had them. Eli's reputation in the cattle community continued to build. He was known as a fair and straight-dealing man, which in Caldwell in that era was the most valuable reputation a rancher could have, and he was asked occasionally to assess stock or advise on trail matters, and the ranch's 12 head of cattle became 25, and the 25 became 40, and by the end of their second year on the property, it was generating enough income that they were not merely surviving but building. Clara, with the particular resource management of someone who had once sold her mother's brooch for stagecoach fare, tracked every dollar with precision and knew exactly where they stood and where they were going. And she and Eli talked about money with the openness that she had learned was either present in a marriage from the beginning or very hard to install later. One evening in the spring of 1880, when William was 6 months old and James and Rose were almost 2 and the ranch was beginning to look like what it would become, Clara and Eli were sitting on the porch after supper, the Kansas evening settling into its particular blue, the cattle visible in the far pasture, the cottonwoods along the creek rustling in a small wind. "I want to tell you something," Clara said. Eli set down his coffee. "All right. I want to tell you that I know what I said when I agreed to let you court me, that I had decided we were going to be all right, the babies and me, and that was what I believed and what I still believe." She paused. "But I want to tell you that you have made all right into something much more than that. You have made it into something I did not dare to think about when I was on that stagecoach, because I could not afford to hope for so much." Eli was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had that particular quality it got when he was moved by something, low and careful, as though he were handling something fragile. "I want to tell you something too," he said. "Tell me." "When I said there was room for 3 more on the ranch, I meant it in the practical sense. I had a house and land, and I could see that you needed a place, and I could see that I needed something I did not quite have a name for yet. But I did not know what it would turn into. I did not know it would turn into this." He gestured at the ranch, at the house behind them, at the evening air. "I did not know it would turn into the best thing I have ever done." She reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned it over and held hers properly, and they sat in the evening light as the stars began to appear, the way they had sat on Agnes's porch 2 years ago, except that now the world was entirely different. Now there were 3 children sleeping in the house behind them and 40 cattle in the pasture, and a kitchen garden, and a barn with horses, and everything they had built together was solid and real around them. The summer of 1880 brought a drought that the territory had not seen in several years, the kind that turned the grass brown in July and made the creek run low and made every rancher in the region watch the sky with an anxiety that became its own weather. Eli managed the water carefully, rotating the cattle between pastures, pulling water up from the well for the kitchen garden, calculating how long the creek would sustain them at its current level. There were difficult weeks when the heat and the uncertainty made everyone on the ranch short with each other, and Eli's stubborn tendency to handle things alone without asking for help created a friction between them that was their most significant disagreement in 2 years of marriage. Clara, who had spent enough time surviving things to recognize when she could help and was being kept from it, said one evening in a tone that was not sharp but was absolutely firm, "Eli, I am your partner in this. In all of it. When there is a problem with the ranch, it is my problem too, and I want to know about it and I want to think through it with you. And your habit of taking the whole weight alone is not something I am going to quietly accept, because it is not fair to you and it is not fair to me." Eli looked at her across the kitchen table, and for a moment his jaw worked in the way it did when he was pushing against his own stubbornness, and then something in him released and he said, "You are right. I am sorry. I have been carrying the drought like it is something I failed at, and I do not want you to worry. I would rather worry with you than watch you disappear into yourself," she said. "That is not a partnership. That is you and a ghost of me." He nodded slowly. "That is fair." They talked through the drought situation together that evening, spreading out the numbers and the options on the kitchen table, and between them they came up with a plan that was better than the one he had been working alone, because she saw things he did not, and he knew things she did not, and together they were simply smarter than either of them was separately. The drought broke in late August with 3 days of heavy rain that refilled the creek and turned the grass green again, and made Pete Grover shout from the barn with a joy that startled the horses. Everyone on the Harte ranch stood in the rain for a moment before having the sense to go back inside, and Clara stood in the doorway of the kitchen with William on her hip and James, and Rose at her knees, both fascinated and slightly alarmed by the volume of the water coming down, and she felt the relief of it like a physical thing. Eli came in from the barn soaked and grinning and kissed her in the doorway with the enthusiasm of a man who has not kissed someone in a while, because he has been too tired and too preoccupied, and she kissed him back with equal enthusiasm, and James said something that was half a word and probably indicated approval, and Rose looked philosophical about the whole thing. By the autumn of 1880, the Harte Ranch had survived its first real crisis and was stronger for it, the way things sometimes are when they have been tested and held. They were not wealthy, not by any measurement that the word usually implied, but they had enough and were building toward more, and enough, Clara knew from experience, was a thing people vastly underestimated when they had it. The town had changed too, or perhaps her relationship with it had. She was no longer the woman who had arrived on the stagecoach with babies and no husband, or rather she was, but she was also Mrs. Harte of the Harte Ranch, who was known for her sewing and for the kitchen garden that produced the best tomatoes anyone had seen, and for the fact that her husband was a fair man and her children were a credit to both of them, and she herself was someone you could rely on if you needed something done properly. She had not needed anyone's approval to become herself, but she had not minded either that the town had come around to seeing her. It was in the late autumn of 1880 that James Whitmore, Clara's former husband, materialized in Caldwell. She saw him from the window of the general store where she was working on a Thursday morning, and she recognized him across the dusty street before her mind had consciously registered who she was looking at. That particular way he held his shoulders and the color of his coat, and the recognition landed in her chest like a cold stone. He was looking for her, that was immediately clear. He went to the hotel, and she could see from the window that he was talking to someone and gesturing, and she stood very still and then said to Patterson, I need to be excused for a few minutes." She walked quickly down the street to Silas Beaumont's office and went in without knocking and said, "Walter is here, in town. What can he do?" Silas Beaumont looked up from his desk, assessed her expression, and said calmly, "Legally, nothing. The divorce was granted by the district court 14 months ago. You are lawfully married to Eli Harte. Walter Whitmore has no legal claim on you or your children." "He could cause trouble," she said. "He could attempt it," Silas said. "But there is nothing legal for him to stand on." She thanked him and went back to the store, and that afternoon when she drove the wagon home, she told Eli. His reaction was the steady, deliberate kind that she had come to know as more serious than visible anger. He went very still for a moment and his jaw set, and then he said, "What does he want?" "I do not know. I did not speak to him. I went to Silas." "Good," he said. That was the right thing. He thought for a moment. "I will go to town tomorrow morning and I will speak to Marshal Henderson, just so Heck is aware. And if Walter comes here." Eli looked at her with a calm certainty that she found, in that moment, more reassuring than any display of anger could have been. "Then I will speak to him, and I will be polite, and I will make it very clear that this is our home and our family, and that there is nothing here for him." Walter Whitmore did not, in the end, come to the ranch. He appeared in Caldwell for 2 days, and Eli did speak to Marshal Henderson, and whether it was the law or simply the arithmetic of the situation, Walter seemed to understand that there was nothing for him here, and he left as quietly as he had arrived. Clara found out later, through the particular efficiency of small-town information networks, that he had heard she had married well and had come out of what she suspected was some combination of guilt and financial need, and finding neither resources nor welcome had simply gone back where he had come from. She did not feel anything complicated about his departure, no unfinished grief, no residual anger, just the clean feeling of a door that had already been closed being confirmed shut. She told Eli that evening and he nodded and said, "Good," and that was the end of it. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was a good winter, as winters go, not as brutal as the previous one, with enough snow to be beautiful and not enough to be dangerous. And the house was warm and the children were healthy, and the marriage was in that settled, deepening phase that comes after the first difficulties have been navigated and the shape of the thing is clear. James and Rose turned 3, and William turned 1, and they had a small celebration on the ranch with Agnes and Hattie Mee and Reverend Douglas and Tom Ridley and Pete Grover. And Agnes brought a cake that she said she had not spent any particular trouble on, but which was clearly a lie. And the children were briefly overwhelmed by so many people before deciding it was the best thing that had ever happened to them. Clara watched Eli with the children that afternoon, watched him lift James onto his shoulders and carry him around the yard, while James held onto his hair with both fists and laughed with the unself-conscious absolute joy of a 3-year-old, and watched him sit on the porch steps with Rose on his lap, while she very seriously explained something to him, and he listened with complete attention, and watched him hold William against his chest with the baby's face turned toward the light. And she felt the fullness of the afternoon like a held breath. He looked up and caught her watching and smiled at her from across the yard, a simple and private smile that was for her alone, and she smiled back, and that was all, but it was everything. In the spring of 1881, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. She had suspected it for a few weeks before she was certain, and when she told Eli at breakfast one morning, he repeated his reaction from William's announcement almost exactly, setting down his coffee cup and looking at her with that startled, deeply pleased expression, and then he said, "A fourth." "A fourth," she confirmed. James, who was 3 and present at the table, looked between his parents and said, "What?" "You are going to have another brother or sister," Eli told him. James considered this with the gravity of someone who has been an older sibling for long enough to have opinions about the arrangement. "Rose has enough to say," he said finally. "A brother might be good." Rose, from across the table, gave him a look of magnificent disdain that she had clearly been practicing. Clara laughed so hard she had to hold her coffee cup with both hands to avoid spilling it. The fourth baby arrived in November of 1881, another boy, and James looked extremely satisfied about this, as though he had personally arranged it. They named him Thomas, after Tom Ridley, who had been such a steadfast friend, and who received the news of the honor with a combination of genuine emotion and embarrassed pleasure that made Eli laugh. The Harte Ranch was by the end of 1881 a place of considerable life: 4 children, a working cattle operation, horses, the kitchen garden, Pete Grover in the bunkhouse, occasional help from other seasonal hands, the steady rhythm of work in seasons and weather, and the particular chaos and sweetness of a household full of small children. Clara had developed the ranch's small side income from her sewing into something more organized, taking commissions from 3 different towns in the area through the mail and the stagecoach delivery. And the money was her own, and went into a fund she was building with a specific intention: to buy the 40 acres adjacent to their property that the owner had indicated he might be willing to sell in another year or 2, because Eli's cattle operation needed more land to grow, and she intended that it would grow. She was a woman who had arrived in Caldwell with nothing but determination, and had built, from that starting point, a life that was full and real and hers. She thought about the woman on the stagecoach occasionally, that younger version of herself who had been so certain they would be all right because she had decided to be. And she felt for that woman a tenderness that was also a kind of pride, because that woman had not been wrong, had in fact understood something essential, that the decision precedes the reality, and the determination is the seed of everything. By the spring of 1882, the Harte Ranch was 4 years into its existence, and the children ranged from 6 months to 4 years old, and the work was enormous, but the life was more than equal to it. There was a Sunday in April that Clara thought of afterward as the day that crystallized everything, not because anything dramatic happened, but because everything was exactly as it should be, and she had the rare presence of mind to know it while it was happening. It was a Sunday, and there was no work because Eli held to the Sunday rest with the conviction of someone who had worked without it for too many years and knew the value of it. And they had been to church in the morning and come home and had the midday meal together. And now in the afternoon the world was full of the particular sweetness of a Kansas spring, the grass bright green, the sky the deep blue that had nothing to do with modesty, the cottonwoods along the creek making their rushing sound in the light wind. Eli was in the yard with James and Rose, teaching them something with a length of rope, and they were paying varying degrees of attention depending on their personalities, James focused and Rose asking questions about everything except the specific thing being demonstrated. Thomas was asleep inside, being a baby of 6 months and having the schedule that entailed. William, 2.5, was sitting near Clara on a blanket in the yard, conducting some private project involving several stones and a great deal of serious commentary directed at them. Clara was sitting on the rebuilt porch with her mending in her lap, and she was not actually mending. She was watching her family in the April afternoon light and thinking about the word family, which had meant something different to her at every stage of her life. It had meant loss when her father died. It had meant struggle when she was growing up in her mother's careful poverty. It had meant betrayal when Walter left. It had meant fierce necessity when she was alone on the stagecoach with 2 babies and the whole continent appearing to offer her nothing. And now it meant this. The yard and the porch and the spring air and the sound of James asking if he could try the rope now, actually try it, and Eli's low voice saying yes, all right, hold it here, and Rose announcing that she had a better method which she would explain if anyone was interested. William looked up from his stones and said something to her that she did not quite understand, which was normal, and she said, "Tell me more," which always worked, and he launched into an explanation that involved considerable emphasis and apparently referred to the stones, and she listened to him with the full attention he deserved because he was a person and his stone theories mattered. Eli looked over at her from across the yard, and she met his eyes, and he tilted his head very slightly in that way he had. The question that was not quite a question, and she answered it the same way she always did, with the look that meant she was good, she was fine, she was more than fine, she was exactly where she had decided to be. Later, when the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet, they sat on the porch together the way they had sat on Agnes's porch and the ranch's first porch and every porch before and since, two people who had found in each other the specific comfort of being genuinely known. "I want to tell you something," Eli said. "You said that before," she said, smiling. "2 years ago on this porch, or rather the earlier version of it." "I did," he agreed, "and I have more to say now than I did then." She waited, looking at the dark ranch under the wide Kansas stars. "I think about the morning you walked into Agnes's kitchen," he said. "Every so often I think about it. 2 babies and a satchel and the look on your face that was just absolute, quiet determination." He paused. "I did not know it in that moment. I thought I was just being helpful, but something in me recognized you. Something in me knew that you were the thing I had been heading toward without knowing where I was going." Clara was quiet for a moment, feeling the truth of his words settle into her. "Something in me knew the same about you," she said. "Not immediately, I was careful." "You were right to be careful," he said. "Yes, but I knew." She looked at him in the dark. "When you held James that first morning and you did not ask me a single personal question and you just talked about the weather and the cattle market, I knew that you were someone I could trust. I did not know what that would become, but I knew that." He reached for her hand across the small table between the chairs, the same gesture as so many evenings before, and she gave it to him, and they sat in the April night with the stars going everywhere above the Kansas plain and the children sleeping in the house behind them and the cattle quiet in the dark pastures and the cottonwoods making their small nighttime sound along the creek. It was not a perfect life. No life was perfect. There would be more droughts and more difficult winters and more of the 10,000 small crises that any life on the frontier contained. The children would grow and be difficult and surprising and wonderful. The work would always be more than enough to fill every hour. The world outside Caldwell was a complicated and not always fair place, and they were not insulated from it. But sitting on the porch with Eli's hand around hers and the ranch quiet and the stars enormous above them, Clara thought that this was the thing she had been working toward on that stagecoach in April 1878. Not just survival, not just being all right, but this specific fullness, this rightness, this life that was hers and that she had built from nothing but a decision. She had decided they would be all right, and they were. They were so much more than all right. In the years that followed, the Harte Ranch grew into one of the more established small operations in the region around Caldwell. The adjacent 40 acres came up for sale in 1883, as Clara had predicted, and with the money she had saved from her sewing commissions and Eli's cattle profits, they bought it, and the ranch became 120 acres of Kansas grassland with good water and strong bones, which was exactly what they had seen in it from the beginning. James grew into a boy of fierce intelligence and considerable stubbornness, who showed, by the time he was 7, a particular affinity for horses, spending hours in the barn in conversation with the animals in a way that reminded Eli of himself at the same age and made him quietly, profoundly happy. Rose grew into a girl who was interested in everything and afraid of nothing, who learned to read from Hattie Me Douglas with the speed of someone who has been waiting for the skill to arrive and springs at it, and who then read every book she could find in Caldwell and beyond, borrowing them, trading for them, demanding them as gifts for her birthday. William was a thoughtful, careful boy who watched everything before he participated in it, and who had a precision with his hands that he put toward carving small animals from wood, first rough, and then increasingly fine, with a talent that made everyone who saw his work look twice. Thomas was loud and joyful and the most purely sunny temperament of the 4. the kind of child who seemed constitutionally incapable of maintaining a bad mood for more than approximately 3 minutes, which was either a great gift or a great mystery, depending on how you looked at it, and which made him deeply beloved by everyone who knew him. And then, in 1884, when Clara was 30 years old and the twins were 6 and William was 4 and Thomas was 2, there came a fifth, a girl this time, born in a July heat wave that made everything more dramatic than it needed to be, but who arrived healthy and loud, and decided in the way of someone who knows exactly where they are going, and they named her Agnes. Because when they told the real Agnes Holt, she looked at them with an expression that moved rapidly through surprise and composure, and then simply collapsed into the honest tears of a woman who has been harder than she needed to be for a very long time and is suddenly allowed to be soft. Agnes Holt said, sitting in the kitchen of the boarding house where it had all begun with the real Agnes, the small furious pink baby in her arms, "That is a very good name." "We thought so," Clara said. "She is going to be trouble," Agnes Holt said, in the tone of someone who considers this a high compliment. "She already is," Eli said from the doorway, and he was smiling in the way he smiled when something was so good it had gone past words. The boarding house was still there on the main street of Caldwell. The general store was still there. The church where they had been married was still there. The town had grown and changed, as towns do, and the cattle trail that had made it wild had begun to quiet as the railroad changed the way the West did its business. And Caldwell was slowly becoming something other than a purely wild place, and becoming instead a community, with schools and civic life, and the particular settledness of a place that has decided to last. On their 6th wedding anniversary, in September of 1884, Eli and Clara rode out to the far eastern edge of their property in the evening, just the two of them. The children left with Pete Grover, who had been with them for 6 years, and was as reliable as the land itself. And they tied the horses near the creek, and walked along the water in the late light under the cottonwoods that were just beginning to show the first edge of autumn color at their tips. They were not talking much, just walking, and the creek made its sound and a bird called somewhere in the distance, and the sky to the west was going amber and gold, and Clara said, 6 years. 6 years, Eli agreed. "It feels like it has been my whole life," she said, meaning it as a compliment to the completeness of it. "In the best way," he said. "In the very best way." He stopped walking and she stopped beside him, and he turned toward her and took both of her hands in his, standing there in the cottonwood light beside the creek that ran through their land, and he said, "I would do it all again. All of it. Every difficult day of 13 years on the trail, because it brought me to that morning in Agnes's kitchen. Every minute of the 2 weeks, I sat around that boarding house with a twisted ankle." She smiled, the full, open smile that she had learned only with him to show without reservation, the smile that had nothing held back. "I am glad you twisted your ankle," she said. "It was the best thing that ankle ever did," he said. He kissed her in the cottonwood light the way you kiss someone after 6 years and 5 children, and every drought and difficulty, and good season and bad one, which is to say with the particular depth of a feeling that has been tested and has held. And she kissed him back the same way, and the creek ran on beside them, and the Kansas sky went all its evening colors, and the cottonwoods rustled, and the world was exactly what they had built it into, solid and real and theirs. She thought, not for the first time and not for the last, of the woman on the stagecoach, the one who had held 2 babies and a worn satchel and the fierce intention to be all right. The one who had walked into a boarding house in Caldwell, Kansas, in April of 1878 with nothing but herself and her children, and the unshakable conviction that she was going to find a way to live. She had not been looking for a man to save her. She had not been looking for love. She had been looking for ground to stand on, and she had found it. And in the finding she had also found Eli, and Eli had found her. And from that particular morning in Agnes Holt's kitchen they had built something that was, by any honest measure, extraordinary. 5 children asleep in a house on 120 acres of Kansas grassland. A man who had been moving for 13 years and had stopped here, in this life, because this was the place that had made stopping make sense. A woman who had arrived carrying twins and no husband, and had been told by a cowboy on a broken-down porch in the spring sunshine that there was room for 3 more here, and who had taken him at his word, and who had found that the room was not merely adequate, but was, in fact, more than she had known to imagine. It was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was exactly right, and it was theirs, and it would last. The stars came out over the Kansas plain the way they always did, without asking permission, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and the creek ran on, and the horses waited patiently by the cottonwoods, and Eli and Clara Harte stood in the evening with their hands joined and the whole of their life behind them and around them and ahead of them, and there was nothing unfinished, nothing uncertain, nothing unresolved. Only the particular and complete fullness of 2 people who had chosen each other in the wild and hopeful middle of the American frontier, and had made, from that choice, a world.